In the late 1400s, Hieronymus Bosch astounded crowds of people with possibly the most famous painting he would ever paint. The Garden of Earthly Delights depicts three versions of humanity. One at the beginning, before the fall, one as temptation begins to take root, and one of the hell that comes afterward. It is the beginning that is most interesting, however. As we know, the seeds of discord that would lead to the inevitable downfall of humanity were sown here, and Bosch endeavored to include these details in his painting. The first part of the triptych, which includes only three figures, depicts God as Christ blessing the union of Adam and Eve. This is a reference to Genesis 1:28, but more importantly, it also shows the two main characters in the story of the fall of humanity. In biblical symbolism, directions have very specific meanings. The right-hand side, the one Adam is on in the triptych, is a symbolically exalted position, referenced in Psalms 118:16. Likewise, the left side, the side of Eve, is the side of evil. The picture, of course painted by someone familiar with biblical literature, is alluding to the coming temptation of Eve, and the subsequent betrayal of the trust God put in her. After all, it was Eve that convinced Adam to take the fruit, and that idea has echoed throughout history, in art just like this, for centuries. The idea that Eve was the faulty party before the fall is also not a forgotten one. Modern literature on Christian apologetics often references both Eve's betrayal and the fact that Eve was created second, when arguing for the adaptation of hierarchical gender roles in modern Christian doctrine. Paul's arguments in the epistles also echo these ideas. For over 1800 years, they have persisted, and continue to affect how we look at women in art to this day. It's 1815, and a young woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin travels with her adulterous lover, the famous poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, across Germany, following the twisting river Rhine. That same winter, Mary would become pregnant with Percy's child, but the baby girl would tragically die only a few days after it was delivered. As the winter turned to spring, the travelers did not return home. In truth, they had nowhere to return to. Mary's relationship with Percy had estranged her from her father. Percy had friends, but was in need of money and work, so he contacted his friend in Geneva, Switzerland, named Lord Byron. During a cold, rainy night, the group entertained themselves by reading a collection of ghost stories. This inspired Byron, who, being a famous writer as well, challenged the party to a literary competition. Whoever writes the best horror story wins. I spent the following days roaming through the valley. I stood beside the sources of the Arveiron, which take their rise in a glacier that with slow pace is advancing down from the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. The abrupt sides of vast mountains were before me. The icy wall of the glacier overhung me. A few shattered pines were scattered around, and the solemn silence of this glorious presence chamber of imperial nature was broken only by the brawling waves or the fall of some vast fragment, the thunder sound of the avalanche or the cracking, reverberated along the mountains, of the accumulated ice, which, through the silent working of immutable laws, was ever and anon rent and torn, as if it had been but a plaything in their hands. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree, also, they diverted my mind from the thoughts over which it had brooded for the last month. I retired to rest at night, my slumbers, as it were, waited on and ministered to by the assemblance of grand shapes which I had contemplated during the day. They congregated around me, the unstained snowy mountaintop, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods and ragged bare ravine, the eagle soaring amidst the clouds. They all gathered round me and bade me be at peace. Today, Mary Shelley's novels are primarily regarded through the influence of the men in her life. Frankenstein, the horror story she finished for Lord Byron's competition, is lauded primarily as a triumph of science fiction and Gothic horror. And it is both of those things. The book contains fascinating combinations of hermetic and alchemical processes. It grapples with the relatively new ideas of galvanism and the power of science. Its depictions of the crumbling towers of Switzerland and the sprawling German mountainscapes are undoubtedly reminiscent of the Romantic poets that she was in the company of. But there is also an often neglected influence. Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a writer as well, and is most famous for her argumentative essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Shelley did not know her mother, as she died shortly after giving birth to her, but this relic of her thought persisted past her death. In the essay, Shelley's mother strongly argued for the education of women beyond the menial housework and governess jobs that were usually expected. To Wollstonecraft, women needed to be taught how to think, how to make art and do science, how to write. In Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's collection of essays entitled The Madwoman in the Closet, they put forth the idea that the making of Frankenstein was propelled into existence by two specific books. The first being the one we already talked about, the Christian Bible, and the second being Paradise Lost by John Milton. The Bible is significant to Frankenstein for a few reasons, the most important of which being its influence on romantic thought. Eve, to the poets, was also a seductress, and while conservative thought around the turn of the 18th century was starting to shift, it had not yet done so, leaving the women of the time, especially the women writers, living in Eve's shadow. This brings us to the second book, Paradise Lost, possibly the single most influential reiteration of the fall of Lucifer, and consequently, the fall of Adam and Eve. Thus Eve with countenance blithe her story told, but in her cheek distemper flushing glowed. On the other side, Adam, soon as he heard the fatal trespass done by Eve, amazed, astonied stood and blank, while horror chill ran through his veins, and all his joints relaxed. From his slack hand, the garland wreathed for Eve down dropped, and all the faded roses shed. Speechless he stood and pale, till thus at length, first to himself he inward silence broke. Many people do not know this, but John Milton did not actually write Paradise Lost. The book was probably started in 1858, but Milton had gone blind in 1852, meaning it needed to be dictated. The entire book was written by amanuenses, or hired scribes, most of whom were women, including his own two daughters. To Gilbert and Gubar, this fact, that Milton's daughters were relegated to simple scribes of their blind father, has forever changed how the world looked at women writers. They ascribe the inception of this idea to Virginia Woolf, but use many references to clarify this point. Not only was the servitude of Milton's daughters a demeaning thing, but Milton's reiteration of Eve's act in raw, beautiful poetry drove this idea home. Paradise Lost, being as widely regarded as it was the fall of a gavel. To them, Milton's work sentenced countless women to a life divided from their creative ability. It made women not artists, not writers, but simply copyists. Things to be influenced, things to be acted upon, just like Eve. And consequently, the female literary canon was both erased and denigrated. Now, you probably already know the plot to Frankenstein, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page. The book does not actually start with Victor's account of his life. Instead, it starts in the Arctic, as we read through the letters of a certain Robert Walton. Walton is the captain of a ship which he has sailed into the grand unknown of the Arctic. He seeks the North Pole, but his ship has been frozen in place by the encroaching ice. While he waits, he writes letters to his sister describing his journey. Through one of these letters, we see Walton's confusion as he gets a report from one of his sailors that a sled was spotted on the ice near the horizon. This is strange, as Walton believed no man had ever come this close to the North Pole before. Days later, they see another sled. This one approaches their ship, and on it we finally meet our main character, Victor Frankenstein, who is very near death and sick with hunger and cold. Walton takes him in, and attempts to nurse him back to health. He realizes that Victor is an astonishingly brilliant man, and eagerly asks him to relate the recent events of his life. Frankenstein seems unwilling to do so, but finally agrees after realizing that the ambition that has ruined his life is about to ruin Walton's if he continues his northward passage. From here on, Victor's tale takes over. Victor's mother died of scarlet fever right before he left for college, leaving him and his little brother William to their father. But before her death, the family adopted a little girl named Elizabeth Lavenza. The bond between Victor and Elizabeth has grown quite strong, and it becomes apparent that a more romantic love might be blossoming as well. As a child, he was also obsessed with the arcane. He spent hours researching old methods of alchemical and hermetic philosophy, only to discover later when he studied at school that these ideas were considerably outdated and disproven. Nonetheless, this drove his audacity onward, and he became devoted to the art of scientific inquiry. Of course, we all know where this led him. The textual reanimation scene is actually quite short. If you were to start reading Frankenstein right now, you might be past it within an hour or two. It unravels like this. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out. When, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard. A convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion, and straight black lips. What is really important, however, especially to Gilbert and Gubar, is what happens after the monster is born. It might seem shocking on first readings, but instantly upon seeing the small movements of animation, Frankenstein is seized with an intense feeling of utter horror. What he thought would be one of the greatest accomplishments of his life has become something he cannot process, and he flees. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept, indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth, in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. An astute reader might find it odd that the two characters Frankenstein meets in his nightmare are the two women in his life, his adopted sister and prospective lover, Elizabeth, and his dead mother. It will be beneficial here to talk about Frankenstein's second title, the modern Prometheus. In old Greek religion, Prometheus was a titan that not only created humans from Earth, but also stole fire, the power of the gods, and gave it to them. For this betrayal, he was chained to a rock by Zeus, and an eagle was sent to eat his immortal liver, which would grow back day after day, only for it to be eaten again. A sentence of eternal punishment. In many ways, Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus. He has created a man, he has given him power, and for that, he is also cursed. By now, it should be obvious the parallel we are drawing here. Prometheus is not the only religious figure who has been cursed for creating life. The first mother, to Shelley, also fits into this category. Prometheus is also, incredibly, an echo of Eve. After Frankenstein wakes up from his delirious sleep, the monster is gone. His workshop is empty, and he is again alone. Anxiously, he tries to act like nothing ever happened. The next segment of the story makes it seem like nothing really did occur. Frankenstein meets with his friend Henry Clerval, who says he looks very ill and takes care of him. This eventually leads to the recovery of his mental faculties, and the reader starts to think that maybe nothing did happen. Perhaps it was all a dream. Perhaps the monster doesn't exist at all. 4 months pass in this way. Then, Frankenstein receives a letter by post from his father. My dear Victor, you've probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I would expect you. But that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy and glad welcome, to behold, on the contrary, tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs, and how shall I inflict pain on my long-absent son? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now your eyes skim over the page to seek the words which are to convey to you the horrible tidings. William is dead. That sweet child, whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart. He was so gentle yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. Frankenstein rushes back home, only to find that his family is distraught. Near where the crime scene happens, Victor sees a shadow, and the monster re-enters his thoughts for the first time after 4 long months. The thing he abandoned has come back. If we treat this symbol of an Eve-like figure as a theme, all of a sudden many characters in Frankenstein come to life. Victor himself, who historically has been treated like an Adam, becomes much more interesting when viewed the other way. Like Eve, he is without a matrilineal presence. His mother dies shortly before the story starts. Like Eve, he is the first person to birth a man anew, as Eve birthed Cain and Abel, and like Eve, his offspring murders another. This does not only work for Victor. The monster, too, contains these themes. Often viewed as a perfect symbol for Lucifer, Eve's characteristics are still present in the creature. No matrilineal presence, a curse of sorrow and pain for simply being created. Lucifer fell from heaven for his betrayal to God, but Lucifer was created by God as well. Eve fell from Eden, but was made by God's own hand. The monster was banished from humanity, but was made by a human. Gilbert and Gubar take this one step further. Not only are Victor and his creation both incredibly accurate depictions of Eve, but so is Mary Shelley herself. She also did not have a mother. She too birthed a child and lost it in the process, a horror that haunted her for many years afterward. William's caretaker is subsequently tried for William's murder, and is put to death. Another blow to the Frankenstein family. In his distress, Frankenstein decides to flee to Mont Blanc. In its natural power, it revives his thought a little. But this is short-lived. Far off in the distance, he sees the thing, running across the icy slopes like an animal. Afire with newfound indignation, he confronts the monster, only to find that the thing understands him. Here, on the icy peaks of the White Mountain, the creature speaks for the first time. Let's pause for a moment and go back to theory. The reason we started this by talking about Milton is twofold. What we already discussed, the damage that Milton's necessity to subjugate his daughters has caused, is of course interesting, but it is also intertwined with Frankenstein's plot. Frankenstein is a retelling of the fall from heaven by Lucifer, recounted by Milton's stilling poetry. The first edition of the novel, of course published under a pseudonym, even has a quote from Paradise Lost on the cover. "Did I request thee, Maker, from clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" This edition is included in almost all modern republications. But there was a second fall after the first, wasn't there? The fall from Eden, and again we circle back to Eve. Now the connection these two falls have is a central part in understanding just how incredible of a book Frankenstein is. I really can't repeat this enough. Shelley, who, like many of the literate elite of her age, was very familiar with Paradise Lost, and also, like them, she related to Milton's tragic protagonist, Lucifer. However, unlike the men in her life, she related to Lucifer because she saw aspects of womanhood in his depiction. She, unlike her travel partners, saw Eve. "How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity, but am I not alone, miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not, then, hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness." The monster's story is a short one. He was shunned and scared off by any people he met. He eventually took refuge in a small shed in the woods connected to a house. He slowly starts to help the small family that lives in the house, in secret. He learns to read and write from books that were left in the woods, one of them, of course, being Paradise Lost. Eventually, he builds the courage to converse with them, but they are terrified and run away, moving out of the house days later. He is again alone. With nowhere to go, he remembers knowing that Frankenstein was from Geneva, and travels there to ask his creator for help. The trip, however, is not easy, and he is harassed by many people along the way, even being shot by one after saving his child from drowning. This embitters him to the reality that humans will forever spurn him, and in a fit of rage, he murders William and plants evidence to blame his caretaker. Though he is still bitter and depressed, he asks Frankenstein to give him one thing, the one thing he deserves: a companion. Frankenstein thinks for a while, before finally agreeing to do so, if he will never again interact with people. Frankenstein travels to England with his old friend Clerval, who is unaware of the entire ordeal. His plan is to split with Clerval at the Orkney Isles, and create the second monster there. He can tell that the creature is following him, small glimpses of a shadow here and there, the outline of a monstrous form in the moonlight at night. On the islands, he starts his work, piecing together another being, this time a woman. But as he does so, terrible thoughts swirl through his mind. What if the woman hates the monster? What if she becomes a creature even angrier and more horrible than the thing he has already created? Or worse, what if they can procreate? What if they, too, make more monsters? During a night after hours of hard work, he goes into a frenzy of panic and rips apart the pieces he had put together for the monster's companion. But then, out of the shadows rises the thing, livid and terrible. And as he leaves, resigned to the hatred that his maker has sentenced him to, he says one last thing. I will be with you on your wedding night. Frankenstein gathers his instruments of life into a small boat and sails out into the Scottish Sea. There he dumps them into the ocean and attempts to return. He is caught in a deadly storm and wrecks, only to wash up on the coast. There he is apprehended and finds out the horrid truth. Clerval, his best friend after all these years, the one that nursed him back to health, is dead. In the midst of another mental breakdown, Frankenstein receives a letter from his father, telling him that he has hoped for years that he would marry Elizabeth. He tries to forestall it, but it must come. He cannot reject the girl he loves or the wishes of his grieving father, so he asks Elizabeth to marry him. She accepts. The night of their wedding is a horrible one for Frankenstein, and yet he refuses to tell Elizabeth why. In a fit of anxiety, he arms himself and sends her to her room while he hunts for the monster. But of course, we all know how this ends. The monster is too powerful, too agile to predict. It finds its way inside Elizabeth's room and strangles her, taking away the love of Frankenstein's life. The grief from this murder is too much for Frankenstein's father, who also dies days later. Frankenstein now has nothing left. His life is in free fall. We return to the frozen ship at the North Pole. Frankenstein has dedicated what remained of his life to hunting what he has created, but to no avail. What he has birthed is of far greater stature and endurance, and he dies of his sickness in Walton's arms. Then, out of the shadows, emerges the thing one last time. But he is no longer an implement of malice. He looks at Frankenstein's corpse with a sadness in his glassy eyes. Walton is furious, even angry enough to confront the thing. He asks why. What horrible things must be done to Victor to sate the creature's appetite for sorrow? The monster answers that Walton does not understand. All of this death, all of this tragedy is but a fraction of the sorrow the monster has felt at being alone. The murders, the torture of his maker, everything is so infinitesimally small compared to the fate he has been cursed with. Polluted by crimes and torn by the bitterest remorse, where can I find rest but in death? Farewell. I leave you, and in you the last of humankind whom these eyes will ever behold. Farewell, Frankenstein. If thou wert yet alive and yet cherished a desire of revenge against me, it would be better satiated in my life than in my destruction. But it was not so. Thou didst seek my extinction, that I might not cause greater wretchedness, and if yet in some mode unknown to me, thou hadst not ceased to think and feel, thou wouldst not desire against me a vengeance greater than that which I feel. Blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine, for the bitter sting of remorse will not cease to rankle in my wounds, until death shall close them forever. But soon, he cried with sad and solemn enthusiasm, I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell. Mary won that little contest between her and her traveling companions. She was only 19 at the time. An often quoted saying when it comes to writing horror is this passage from H.P. Lovecraft. It is a good one, and horror literature has evolved so well over the years that we have almost limitless ways to explore the things we do not know. Horror today is not just something we engage with to feel thrilled or scared. It also gives us many interesting perspectives that we wouldn't be prone to engage with otherwise. Shelley knew something that would scare the men around her, including her lover. and though she used many themes from her father and patrilineal upbringing, she also remembered her mother. She knew something that her companions did not. She knew about the swirl of intense emotions, the power, and yes, the horror of birthing a living being and losing it. Because, in the end, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, William Godwin, they couldn't have written Frankenstein, because they didn't know what it was like to be painted on the left-hand side. They didn't know how it felt to be treated like Eve, the first person to birth a human anew, the woman, the modern Prometheus.